All right, guys, so before we get started, let's talk a little bit about what Redux actually is. Now, if any of you have watched any other courses or you watch my YouTube channel, you probably know I'm more of a hands-on type of instructor where I like to explain things through the code rather than using diagrams or talking all sorts of theory and stuff like that. I prefer to learn that way, and I also prefer to teach that way. But I will talk a little bit about what Redux is before we actually jump in and start coding and setting it up. Now, as you saw, we can create React components, okay? We obviously do that without Redux. And a component is basically a piece of your UI. It can be whatever. Let's say our registration form. Now, our registration form actually had its own state. It had component level state. And that state is only available within that component. Okay, remember each input had its own state value. We also had errors in the state. You can't access that from anywhere else. And that's where Redux comes in, is when you need application level state, okay, and you need to share data between components, and that's basically the purpose of Redux. All right, a simple example would be, let's say, a to-do list that has one component, let's call it a list component, that lists all the to-dos, and then a form component that's used to add to-dos. Now, you're going to want to access the to-dos or the to-do state from your list component. You're also going to want to access them from the form. You're going to want to be able to add them to the from the form. And this is where Redux comes in. Instead of passing things from component to component, which gets very, very tedious and confusing, and in a large application, it's just not the right way to do things. With Redux, you get a single source of truth that you can dispatch to all of your components. So you can send your to-dos to any component you want. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have component level state. In fact, for some things such as forms, you want that component level state, just like we did. We're going to keep that those input values as component state values. It's just things that you want to share between components that you want to use Redux for. All right. So in our application, for example, we'll have an auth state or an authentication so that we can have the user that's logged in, his ID, his avatar, things like that. We'll have a profile state, which will hold all the profile data that we need for certain components. We'll have posts for our post pages. We'll have errors. I want to have an errors reducer, and I'll talk about what reducers are in a second. This is all stuff that we want to share throughout our entire application. All right, so let's take a quick look at this diagram here. And I'm not very good with explaining diagrams or anything, but I'll give it a shot, and hopefully you can just, whatever sticks, and then you'll understand more in the code. So basically we have our UI here. This is our React application with our components. Now, what we want to do is let's take the register, for example. Remember, we had an onSubmit and we did the Axios request from there. We don't want to do that. We want to put that into an action. So from our component, we'll be able to map Redux actions using properties. So we'll be able to say like this.props.register user or something like that, which will be stored in an action creator file, okay, which will just be a list of functions. Once that function's called, that's where we'll make the fetch request or the Axios request. All right, then we get the data back from our backend, and it depends what we want to do with that data. Okay, if we want to send that along to the reducer, then we'll do that. Okay, so let's say we get the user back, we send it to the reducer, and then we can implement that into our state. Now, state is stored in your store. In Redux, you have one store, and that's it. Okay, if you've used Flux before, which is another state manager used with React quite a bit, you can have multiple stores, which gets really confusing, and I don't like Flux at all. But basically, our reducer can reduce our state to whatever we'd like, okay? And you can't really change your state or mutate it. You basically make a copy of it, and you can add what you want to it, and then it gets sent back down. All right, so an example, let's say with a to-do list, we could say add to-do, goes to an action called add to-do. That to-do gets sent to the reducer. Then that reducer sends down the state with the new to-do to another component that wants to update okay, that wants to update with those to-dos. All right, and that may be a crappy explanation, but I promise you, as we move along and you start to write the code, you'll start to understand it more. So don't just say, you know, screw this guy, I don't know what the hell he's talking about, and shut it off. Because I understand that feeling when you just can't grasp something. And who knows, maybe I did a good job explaining it, I don't know. But what I want to do now is, I think this will help a little too, is to look at our finished application and look at the Redux Chrome extension, which is just fantastic. I would not be able to learn Redux or use Redux without this extension. Okay, we'll be using it quite a bit throughout the course. So this is our actual application. It's up live on Heroku right now, and you can see our application state over here. So basically we have 4 pieces here, and we're going to have reducers for each of these. So errors is obviously, there's nothing in here. We have no errors. Auth contains an object with is authenticated, which is false, meaning we're not logged in. The user is blank because we're not logged in. Okay, we have profile, which holds a single profile, which is null, an array of profiles, which is null because we don't need it for this page right here, or this, I guess I could say, this painting of our UI or of our application. Loading just means, like, if we're making an AJAX request, this will turn to true. Once we get the response, this will turn back to false. That way we can have like a little spinner if it's actually fetching data. If we look at post, we have an array of posts, which is empty, of course, because we're not showing any posts here. We don't need it. We have a single post object, and then we have, again, loading. So this is basically going to be our state for this application. Now, if I go to developers, this is a list of profiles, right? So let's take a look at the profile state. Now, profiles, plural, the array is actually full. It has these two guys in it with all the data. Okay, so see how that works? This component needed this piece of state, so Redux sent it to it. If we want to see a single profile, notice how this is null right now. If I click on view profile, you saw how the loading turned to true for a second. That's when it was fetching the data. Now it's back to false, and we now have the single profile data inside here. Okay, let's see. So the auth, we have is authenticated false. If I go ahead and I log in, so I think John Doe at Gmail will work, and we log in, and notice over here, these are all the actions that are being called. Okay, so get profile was just called, and now profile is actually filled with the logged in user because we're on the dashboard, and that's what I requested for this component. All right, and if we look at the auth, is authenticated is now true, and user holds the logged in user. Okay, and that's where we're getting like welcome John Doe and stuff like that. Okay, the experience, that comes from the profile state. So this right here, if we look in profile experience, that's the data that you're seeing right here. All right, so hopefully this can help you a little bit understand why we need Redux. And then diff is just going to show us the difference in state between requests, or between like if I go to posts, you'll see that now it shows the difference in the state before I went to posts, and then state just shows us the entire thing. All right, and you can see right here, get posts, that was just called. And these are examples of action types, which are basically just constants. All right, and I know this is a lot to take in, and I know it seems confusing if you've never used Redux, but you know, try to bear with me and just follow along. Write the code, and we'll be doing enough of it where it's going to stick. All right, so let's continue in the next video, and we'll start to actually implement Redux.